Hey, Faith family, I hope you guys are doing well. So glad to be back with you guys as we continue in our current series, Greater Love. We learned last week about the humiliation, the crucifixion, and the insults that Jesus had suffered as he willingly endured awful suffering so that we might experience amazing salvation. Today we'll learn about the final moments of Jesus' life and his death. We'll see that what the Jewish leaders meant as evil, God intended for good. They wanted to take his life away to continue to exercise their control, but Jesus' authority would not be denied. Jesus' life was not taken, he gave it freely. So Jesus hung on the cross where he was crucified from about midday to around 3 p.m., and there was a terrible darkness that settled over the entire area as if a great big shadow had been cast over Jerusalem. This is the middle of the day, yet darkness fills the sky. And after this darkness had been present for quite some time, Jesus cries out to God the Father. He says, my God, why have you abandoned me?" And this cry from Jesus is nearly an exact quote from Psalm 22, again pointing to Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament text. Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far from my deliverance and from my words of groaning?" If you're wondering why Jesus felt like he had been abandoned by God in his moment of greatest need, you have to understand that the Father in heaven is doing exactly that. Jesus is drinking the cup of the wrath of God poured out on sin. This is the cup of wrath that Jesus prayed about in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is absorbing the punishment of sin. And as he is doing so, God the Father turns away from that horrific sin that Jesus is enduring and taking on. And this may seem confusing to us, but we have to remember that God cannot tolerate sin in his presence. If you've ever seen the movie, The Passion of the Christ, you know that this movie is a very graphic, if not accurate, picture of the physical suffering that Jesus endured on that day. There's no doubt that the physical agony was horrible, but the pain of having all the sins of the world poured out on Jesus would have been even worse. And on top of that, the spiritual separation that Jesus would have felt from his Father in heaven would have only added to the suffering. Jesus suffers even further by sacrificing his intimacy with the Father. Verse 50 says, "But Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and gave up his spirit." Even in his death, Jesus was in control. He decided it was time to breathe his last breath, and so he did. This is the moment of the death of Jesus, and it's clear by the events that surround the death of Jesus that this was no ordinary man. When Jesus gave his life on the cross, several supernatural occurrences only highlighted Jesus' deity. Not only the darkness and the earthquakes that occurred, but also the tearing of the curtain in the sanctuary and the resurrection of the dead. Make no mistake, the timing of these supernatural occurrences clearly point to the reality of the sovereign hand of God at work. God is bringing all of this together to magnify the fact that Jesus was no ordinary man. And as the centurion and those that were with him recognized this when they said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." It's worth pointing out that the curtain that was torn in the temple was no ordinary curtain. It was a very large curtain, measuring 60 feet high and 30 feet wide. It would have been about 6 inches thick and could have required hundreds of men to lift it. And as this curtain was torn from top to bottom, 60 feet up in the air, the only explanation would have been a supernatural act of God. Part of what's so significant about this moment was that this was a vivid demonstration that access to God is now wide open because of the work of Jesus. Mankind does not need to go through a priest any longer. Jesus, the great high priest, had opened wide the door to God. And on top of that, we have the description of the tombs of the dead opening up and their resurrected bodies walking into the city. Can you imagine what people were thinking in the city? A great darkness had overtaken the land, and then a huge earthquake happened and opened tombs all over the face of Mount Sinai. And then the people who have been resting in those graves were resurrected and entered into the city and were wandering around. I can tell you this, they may not have had a clue what was going on, but they knew that it was something that came from God. This was all a part of God's plan, and the devotion that these disciples had to Jesus after his death, burial, and resurrection drove them to minister for Jesus. For hundreds of years after this, the disciples of Jesus would be moved by their love and for the devotion to Jesus, and they would minister all over the world with great sacrifice, with great effort, with great commitment. So what about you? Have you forgotten the wonder and splendor of Jesus' death? Have you forgotten the access that Jesus' death gives us to the Father in heaven? Have you come to God by the work of Jesus? Have you taken part in this wonderful reality accomplished by the death of Jesus? One thing we must remember, with the death of Christ, our sins became powerless to rule over us and destroy the works of the devil.